Alrighty, welcome back to this first video of chapter 3. We'll be talking all about the heart. Um, so to start, there's two different types of cells within the heart. There are contractile cells and autorhythmic cells. Now, autorhythmic cells are the cells like in the nodes of the heart that can spontaneously depolarize, like the SA node, the AV node, and even the Purkinje fibers. Can also do this themselves. Contractile cells, on the other hand, are the heart cells that are responsible for contracting the heart. Now, the action potentials for heart cells look quite a bit different than the ones from neurons, and this is because of some unique channels that cardiac cells have, and these serve special purposes. So, for contractile cells, the kind of unique channel that they have are IK1 channels. Now, what IK1 channels are is they're actually more more of them are open at lower voltages, at more negative voltages. So, for an example, these IK1 channels, they're responsible for setting the resting membrane potential. And at RMP, all of them are basically open. And that means that there's a very high permeability to potassium. So, the resting membrane potential for contractile cells are a lot lower than for neurons. And they're a lot closer to the Nernst potential for potassium. And that's because of the high permeability. And that is because of the IK1 cells. And now what's interesting is as a uh, action potential or graded potential begins and the cell begins to depolarize, what will happen is the IK1 channels will close at a certain threshold. And then instead of the potassium current being there, the potassium current will be gone. And this I it just stands for current. So the current of potassium 1 is basically what that means. So once a depolarization wave is sent over to the contractile cells, that will cause voltage-gated sodium channels to open. And so a current of sodium will rush in. That will cause a big spike in depolarization, at which point the ITO1 and ITO2 cells or channels will be opening. Now, throughout this period of time, the voltage gated calcium channels are also being opened, but they open quite a bit. Like it takes a lot longer for them to actually open. And so you don't actually see them contribute to current until right here at the plateau phase. Now, what the ITO1 and ITO2 currents are is the ITO1 currents are the current of transient outward, which means they're open for a very short amount of time and allows elements and atoms to leave outwards. And what's the element that leaves outwards? Well, that's potassium, right? So that causes a very quick depolarization. And what contributes to this um, really quick repolarization right here is also ITO2 channels, which are actually calcium activated chloride channels. Now the chloride will come into the cell, so this O is kind of useless for us there, but that's because they discovered the potassium ones first. But anyways, the chloride will come rushing into the cell, which will also help to repolarize the membrane for that moment. And they're calcium activated, and so the little bit of calcium inflow that is happening along this climb is activating the chloride channels to open. Great. So that causes a very quick repolarization of the cell. And then the calcium channels are finally open. And at this point, most of it is L-type calcium channels. There's L-type and T-type calcium channels. And T-type are open just transiently, which means they're not open for very long. And L-type are long-lasting, and they're open for longer. Um, and in contractile cells, really, the only calcium channel that contributes to current is the L-type. So as the L-type calcium channels are opening, causing this current here, that will balance out the ITO1 and ITO2 channels and cause the like the positive charges coming in and then negative charges coming in are starting to equalize each other, and so it reaches a kind of equilibrium, and so you stay at this plateau phase where the membrane potential stays the same. Now at this point, there's delayed rectifying potassium channels, and they're signified right here, IKUR, IKR, IKS, and that just stands for potassium ultra rapid, potassium rapid, and potassium slow. So you can imagine what channels will open first. Obviously, the ultra rapid ones will open first, and then the rapid ones, and then the slow ones. And this kind of gradual opening of more delayed potassium channels um, compensates for the increased amount of calcium coming in because of more L-type channels opening. But once the IKS channels open, that kind of starts to tip the membrane potential over its edge because so much potassium is leaving that it just starts to, the membrane potential really just starts to drop. And once it gets to a certain threshold, then the IK1 channels will open, which will also further drop it, and it will go back down to resting membrane potential. And now, because you have practically complete permeability here at RMP, you will not see the sort of hyperpolarization that you see in skeletal muscle cells. So none of that right there. Great. Now that's contractile cells. And the importance of the calcium right here coming in is that will allow the heart cell to contract, right? Because calcium moves troponin. And we'll go into that a little bit later. And so this plateau phase is kind of the phase that the muscle can contract. And then after that, the sucker pump kind of catches up and gets rid of the rest of the calcium. So contractile cells, they contract, and that's how it happens. Autorhythmic cells are really special. They don't have IK1 channels, but what they do have is they have funny channels. So we represent that with an IF, a current of funniness. And then they're another name for them are HCN channels, and that stands for hyperpolarized cyclic nucleotide activated, which means that there's two things that can activate HCN channels, and that is hyperpolarization, like right there, and cyclic nucleotides like CAMP. Now, hyperpolarization activates these HCN channels, which allow for an inflow of sodium. Okay, so it kind of allows for a steady inflow of sodium, and that will cause the membrane potential to continually rise, which is really cool. So there's no actual real resting membrane potential for autorhythmic cells because once they get hyperpolarized enough, the funny channels open and then it just starts to climb back up. Once it reaches a certain threshold, there are no voltage-gated sodium channels. So you have the HCN channels, but no voltage-gated sodium. And so what will actually cause further depolarization are L-type and T-type calcium channels. And the T-type have a little bit lower of a threshold, and so they're open for like a very small amount of time. Lower down here, and that kind of helps get the membrane potential up to the L-type calcium channels threshold, and that ultimately causes this big hump. Now, it's more of a hump instead of a spike, and that's because the calcium channels take longer to close, and than the sodium channels do, right? So calcium is kind of like a really slow force, just like voltage-gated potassium channels are. And so these are also voltage-gated potassium channels over here, and that will cause the repolarization of the membrane in the autorhythmic cells. Then once it gets hyperpolarized enough, the funny channels start to open, and that causes a steady climb, just like that. So really, really cool. The autorhythmic cells are spontaneously depolarizing. The SA node is the fastest one, and it does this at about 60 to 80 beats per minute. The AV node does it about 40 to 60, and the Purkinje fibers only do it at about 20 beats per minute. So the SA node is kind of the one leading the gang, and if the SA node fails, then the AV node can take over. If the AV node fails, then the Purkinje fibers can take over. But a 20 beats per minute heart rate is not very high. Not sure if you can survive on that. So Yeah. One last note here on our algorithmic cells is there's also potassium channels that are affected by acetylcholine, and we'll get into that later. Those are called GERK channels, G protein inward rectifying potassium channels, and they can contribute to kind of the membrane potential at the beginning. Great. Now, we can track this depolarization wave throughout the heart by use of an EKG, otherwise known as an ECG in the United States. I like EKG better though, because I'm European. I'm actually not, but it just sounds cooler. So you have these. Sorry, my wife. My wife was enjoying my sarcastic jokes. Okay, so we have the heart here, right? Atriums, ventricles here and here. You'll notice the left ventricle is a little bit smaller, and that's because it's a lot more muscular, and that will play an important part soon. So you have the SA node up here, and it treble, and then the AV node over here. And the AV node has a slight delay, which allows for the kind of bum bum beat, rhythm of our heartbeat. And so the atriums contract first, and then the ventricles. So the way we have to think about this is that when the inside of the cells get depolarized, they become positive on the inside, and so then the outside becomes relatively negative. And so what we're going to be tracking on the EKG is we can only track the extracellular fluid. We don't really know what's happening inside the cell. So what the ECG does is it tracks the electric potential and the electrical gradient and the electrical field set up by our body and the fluid. And so when the cells are depolarized, that means the fluid outside the cells is negative, and that's what we're going to be tracking. So in an ECG, when we see a negative charge, that means that those cells are depolarized, which means the inside of the cells are positive. Kind of a little thing that you have to wrap your head around. Now, when this happens, the SA node starts to depolarize, right? There's a negative charge that builds up, and then that negative charge kind of spreads out. And the direction in which it spreads is kind of a net direction of that direction. All right. So you have a negative charge going down like that. Now, in order to track an EKG, we have to put sensors on the body. And the easiest way to think about it is there's a bunch of different leads or sensors that we put on the body. There's like 12 different kinds. And the one that that best represents what we see on average of all of them combined together is lead number 2. And so when we talk about this, we're just going to be using lead number 2 as an example. There's a lot more leads and sensors going on, but for simplicity, we're just going to talk about this one. And you have a positive sensor down at the bottom and a negative sensor up at the top. And that's kind of the setup of the lead and of the sensors. And what's important to know is in an EKG, when you have opposite charges going towards each other, then the EKG, the EKG is kind of continually plotting points like this. And when there's a negative charge going towards a positive charge, it reads that difference in uh, elect electricity, that kind of electric field that's set up. It reads that and it causes it to jump up. And then as that separation of charges decreases, then it goes down, kind of like that. So, as you can imagine, then, if there's a negative charge up here at the SA node, and this all part gets depolarized, the greatest separation of charges will be when about half the atrium's depolarized, and it's going in this direction, which is towards the positive sensor. So a negative charge going to a positive sensor will cause an upward deflection. And the maximum will be reached when there's maximum charge separation, where the outside of these cells is negative and the outside of these cells over here is positive. Then, as the rest of the atrium gets depolarized, what did they, the EKG will go back down to its isoelectric point is what we call kind of the baseline. Okay. Now, this depolarization of the atriums is called the P wave. And it's kind of nice. This is kind of the one time that things make a lot of sense in physiology. They're just like really, really simple, and it's just you just have to know the alphabet. And it goes P, Q, R, S, T. So pretty great. So the first wave is the P wave. Don't ask me why they started on the P. I don't know. But these two atriums are getting depolarized. Now there's, for fun information, there is a kind of string of fibers that go across from the right atrium to the left atrium called Bachman, yeah, Bachman's bundle. And that carries the depolarization wave and allows this other atrium to get depolarized pretty fast as well. Great. Now, then the AB node takes a little bit longer to depolarize because of that delay, and so there's a little bit of a delay. And then what happens is the AB node sends signals through the um, bundle of what? No, the bundle of His. It sends the signals through the bundle of His over to these bundle branches. So you have these bundle branches that come down, and the bundle of His connects the AB node to the bundle branches. And as the signal goes across Bachman's bundle and down, it actually goes faster down the left ventricle. And this is because the left ventricle is thicker, conducts negative charge better. So it goes down faster and then it starts to depolarize here. Now the right side is going down, but it takes a little bit to catch up. And so what the net effect, the net electrical field that we're seeing is as this left bundle branch gets depolarized, it will cause, it'll try to help the right bundle branch keep up and spread upwards like this. And so that's a net direction that way. And that's a negative charge going towards a negative charge. And so that's a downward deflection. And this downward deflection is called the Q wave. Great. Now, this continues. The bundle branches continue to depolarize. And then you have the Purkinje fibers that are wrapping around the ventricle from the Purkinje fibers. And so what happens is you have a bunch of negative charge going down this way, and then the Purkinje fibers pull it up this way, and the endocardium here gets depolarized first, and then sends it down. And so then the depolarization wave goes out like this. So you have net direction of electrical field moving this way, and that causes a huge spike. And that is called the R wave. The R wave. Now, yeah, that's the R wave. Great. So then basically this entire heart is depolarized. And because the left side is thicker, what happens is the left lateral superior ventricular wall is not completely depolarized. This area right here. It takes a little bit longer because the left ventricle is so thick. So once all of these bottom parts get depolarized, then it starts to spread up like this. And that's a net direction going that way. And so that will cause, that's a negative charge going towards a negative charge. So that will cause a further deflection downwards. And then once that electrical gradient is zero, right? The electrical field is zero in the sense that the entire heart is now depolarized, right? The entire heart's now depolarized. That brings it back to the isoelectric point. Now, What's important to note is that the plateau phase, right, which is this part right here, the plateau phase in the endocardial cells is actually longer than in the epicardial cells. So you would expect that if these endocardial cells were depolarized first, they would also repolarize first. Wrong. They don't do that. And that's because the plateau phase is longer. And so it takes a little bit longer for the endocardial cells to relax and to repolarize. And so what happens is the wave of repolarization. I'm going to draw myself a new heart because this is all negative. Um, Ventricles, interventricular septum. Okay. So it's all negative, and I'll use blue to show a positive charge going back. But you can assume that this is all, the heart is completely depolarized, and the repolarization begins on the epicardium because the endocardial cells have a longer plateau phase, right? They take longer to relax. So the positive charge, which is on the outside the cells, right? The cells are repolarizing, so they're getting back to a negative resting membrane potential. But the extracellular fluid is positive. So that causes it to flow up this way, which is a net movement of that way. And this is a positive charge in the extracellular matrix moving towards a negative charge. So that is a positive deflection. It's like this. And then as the charge separation decreases, the amount that the EKG is deflected upward decreases, and then it reaches its isoelectric point again. And this is the S wave, where it was the depolarization of this left anterior supraventricular or superior ventricular wall. And this is the T wave right here, which is associated with the depolarization or the repolarization of the heart. So the T wave is the repolarization of the heart. That's what it represents. The P wave represents the depolarization of the atrium. The Q wave represents the depolarization of that left interventricular septum. And then the R represents the depolarization of the ventricle. The S represents the final depolarization of the superior left ventricular wall. And then the T wave is repolarization of the ventricle. And we assume that the repolarization of the atrium is kind of just caught up in the repolarization of the ventricle because it's so much bigger, right? Great. So that's how an EKG works. Now, there can be some problems that develop in your heart, especially if the heart becomes hypoxic, right? And that can be caused by a variety of factors. Maybe the coronary arteries that come up out of the heart. If they get clogged, that's no bueno, and that prevents blood flow from getting to the heart. And so the endocardial cells will become, they very well might become hypoxic, right there, those endocardial cells. So that can be a problem. And if the endocardial cells become hypoxic, um, that will cause them to kind of stay depolarized. Um, and that's a problem. So if those cells stay here because they're hypoxic, then if they stay above in a positive membrane potential, then that means that there will always be a constant signal to the EKG of charge separation. So a normal EKG would be down here, right? However, if just these endocardial cells are hypoxic and are depolarized, well, then that means that there is a constant signal going this way because this depolarization will begin to spread. And that's a negative charge moving towards a positive charge. And so that will cause the EKG to begin it will cause its isoelectric point to be higher than what it normally is. So that's the problem. So the entire EKG goes along, starting at this higher point, right? Because of this background current of injury is what we call it. It's a background current. And so the P wave goes, the atrium's depolarized, then we got the QRS complex, and when it hits the S, right? The S is the depolarization, is the finishing of the depolarization of the ventricle up in this area, and it's a downward deflection. And what happens is it'll actually go down so far because the entire heart is now depolarized. And that means that there's no separation of charges. And so the EKG will be lower. Now, its isoelectric point normally is up here because of that background current. But suddenly there's no background current because all of the cells have the exact same charge. And that causes the S wave to go lower than what we would normally see it go. And then the entire cell will repolarize, causing the T wave, and it will go back to this point right here that's set up because these endocardial cells will stay depolarized even though everything else is repolarized. And so it'll stay back at its isoelectric point, and then this cycle will continue again. So this right here, this phenomenon is what we call ST depression, and it's also called an N STEMI. And I'll explain that a little bit more after I explain this. Now, another problem here is the hypoxia becomes really serious, then the entire wall of the ventricle will be hypoxic, and that's called a transmural infarct. Transmural because it's across walls. It goes all the way through the wall. And what this will happen is this will cause a current of injury to occur as well. And because it's the entire wall, the only way it really has to go is up. And so that will cause the isoelectric point to move down, right? Because this is a negative charge moving towards a negative charge. So instead of it being the isoelectric point being up here like normal, the EKG thinks that it's lower down because of this background current. So then depolarization of the atrium start, and then you got depolarization of the left bundle branch, which then spreads up, and then the depolarization of the ventricle, right here, the R, and then the S, right, that the at the end of the S wave, that's when the entire heart is depolarized, and when there's no charge separation, the normal isoelectric point is right here, right? And so what happens is the S wave is a lot higher than normal, and the R wave kind of like stops short. And then the T wave goes again normal, and when it ends, right, when all the cells are repolarized, this little section is still not repolarized. So it causes this background current that causes it to be lower again, and that will continue the cycle. And this is a really bad sign because that means that the heart has become really, really hypoxic. And this is called a STEMI, which stands for an ST elevation, which is what this is, right? The S wave is elevated, so it's an ST elevation myocardial infarct, which is basically a heart attack. And so this is the less serious version over here, and that's called an NSTEMI, which is not. It means a non-STEMI. So ST depression is just not an ST elevation, and that's kind of great. So these are some abnormal EKGs that you might see. Very dangerous. Now, when the heart gets stimulated, um, you know what? We'll save this for the next video, actually, and then we'll continue.